Hello and Assalamu alaikum everyone. Hope everyone can see us right now. Sorry for the delay. There were some technical issues on Microsoft Teams and we couldn't actually start off earlier. Hope you all got the new link and we can start off right now. Thank you so much, Andreas, for waiting for us for that long. So let's begin our talk today. Hello and Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to our very first COVID Design e-talk series. Hope everyone is staying safe and keeping healthy. This pandemic has given us so much. It is a threat to not only to our health, but to the way of to how we live. It's just how we communicate, how we perceive things. We had to change. We had to adapt and react to the new reality. So we decided to gain from this opportunity and came up with this idea to connect to the world, to connect and communicate to the art and design fraternity from all around the world. So today we have our first speaker from all the way from Germany, Mr. Andreas Duspohl. He's the director of International Newspaper Museum in Aachen, Germany. Welcome, Mr. Duspohl. Thank you so much for giving us your precious time and talking to us today.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm very much looking forward to it.
So I will start off by playing Mr. Andreas Duspohl's wonderful introduction. Could you all see that right now?
Yeah.
I hope you do.
Yes.
Can't hear anything.
Yes, can't hear it.
Okay, just wait. Can you guys hear it now?
Yes.
Hello, my name is Andreas Duspohl, and I'm the director of the International Newspaper Museum in Aachen. After studying history, philosophy, and English literature here in Aachen at the RWTH Science University, I became a research fellow at this museum, and at that time I curated a couple of exhibitions with historical newspaper material. The museum had been modernized the last time in the early 1960s, so it was time for a change. The local government appointed me as the director and gave me the mission to write a concept for the modernization, which was then implemented. The whole process took 2 years with a total cost of around 2 million euro. The museum is based in one of the oldest civil buildings in Aachen, dating back to 1495. So the restoration of the building itself was complicated and costly. But in 2011, we were able to open the completely modernized new Media Museum. Ever since the museum was founded in 1880, one of the main activities has been the collection of newspapers, so that today our archives hold more than 350,000 copies. You can see that for yourself on our homepage. It is all in German, sorry for that. But if you check Land, which means country, you will find 51 newspapers from Pakistan. Or if you choose Sprache, which means language, you can pick Urdu and you will find that we have 36 newspapers written in Urdu. In case you are interested in reading any of these papers, send us an email and we can digitalize them and send you the scans. Main focus of the museum is creating media competence to show our visitors and especially students and school children how the media system works. We, of course, display the history of newspapers, but the focus lies on subjects like proper research, press freedom and journalism.
and that includes radio, television, and social media. With about 20,000 visitors per year, we consider ourselves as an important learning facility, as we do all kinds of workshops with school classes. Lectures and small conventions attribute to our main aim to promote newspapers in showing their significance throughout the centuries. I'm very much looking forward to meeting you all online, and I hope we'll have a constructive session. The main focus will lie on the foundation of the first newspapers as a consequence of the media revolution that was triggered by Gutenberg's invention of book printing. See you all on the 25th.
Thank you so much, Mr. Andreas. So before I give the floor to Mr. Andreas, I would like to I would like to give a heads up to the audience that they can have we have a Q&A session at the end, so they can write up their questions in the chat box, and we would like to answer as many questions as we can at the end of our conversation. So over to you, Mr. Andreas. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This is the first time for me doing this online, so it's all a bit new for me as well. But I hope you can see my presentation. I'm going to start off with an introductory lecture, which will be under half an hour, I think. And after that, we can talk. Ask me any questions, as long as it's not about cricket, because I have no idea about cricket. Yes, the headline is The Founding of the Newspaper, a journey through the history of communication in early modern times. It may sound a little boring at first, but as you will see at the end, I will try to return to our current day and show how much parallels there can be seen from historical events to events right now. I will be talking about how media can change society. We are living in times of fast and extreme change. Actually, we are living in revolutionary times. The digital revolution changes many aspects of our lives, and the core of the change is a new media system. We can relate to current event later. Let's look at history first. This lecture depicts the major developments that lead to the main medium of the public sphere in the 19th and 20th century, the newspaper, as an example for new media. I will go back in time to show, I will go way back in time to show how media have always transformed society. By the way, what you can see here is a caricature by Henri Daumier from about middle 19th century. He is like the founder of modern caricatures, and at the end you will see another nice one of his. As you can see in this picture, the woman doesn't seem to be as amused as the man by reading the newspaper. The first media revolution took place around 6,000 years ago, the founding of scripture. Before that, people had to memorize everything. So questions like which plants are poisonous, how do you hunt big animals, what do you do when you have stomach pain, all that had to be memorized and told to the children, who had to tell their children as well. So suddenly, with the invention of scripture, it was possible to write all this down, to actually externalize human memory. This changed the course of humanity a great deal. Cities emerged in the regions where scripture was founded, mainly in the regions of Mesopotamia, in Iraq today, and in Egypt. Because the operation of a city requires a lot of information, such as taxes, protection, waste disposal, and of course the supply of daily needs like food, water, and trade goods. It was only up to then that big cities were feasible, because of the information concerning the operation of a city could be stored and used at any time when it was needed. A major improvement to the cuneiform scripture and the Egyptian hieroglyphs was the alphabet, which transformed the multitude of symbols into an efficient typographical system. At first, especially during the course of the Roman Empire, all letters were capital letters, which is good for inscriptions like this one in Rome or gravestones, but it's not good for reading texts, longer texts, or even books. So in the city of Aachen, from where I'm talking to you right now, the next improvement was developed. Around the year 800, so we're talking about a situation 1,200 years ago in this city, Emperor Charlemagne made Aachen the capital of his realm. He built the cathedral, which a photo I took yesterday. He built the cathedral, which still dominates the old town and was the first German monument to be listed as UNESCO World Heritage. You can see the round bit in the middle, that's actually 1,200 years old. Charlemagne invited scholars to his court in order to develop science and culture. One of the main achievements was the transformation of the typographical system into something that looks a lot more like modern script, the so-called Carolingian minuscule. Today we are used to having capital letters and small letters, but at that time that was a very revolutionary and advanced thought. During the Middle Ages, well, I have to make clear that when I talk about events like this, Middle Ages and early modern times, I'm referring to Europe. In Europe, we roughly define the Middle Ages as to span from around 500 to 1500 CE. At that time, most of the people were illiterate, and books were only read in monasteries or maybe some courts, perhaps. In order to copy a book, it had to be copied by hand, mostly by monks who couldn't read or write either. They basically drew off every single letter. And this process, of course, is very time-consuming and inefficient. Plus, the books were made of parchment, which is very expensive, and its production time consuming and costly. The introduction of papermaking in Europe was a major step in making reading material much better available and affordable. The first papermaking facilities emerged in the 11th century in Italy. And the first paper mill in Germany was founded in the year 1377 CE in the city of Nuremberg. Here we have a picture of Nuremberg, which is a bit later. I think it's from the 1490s, but you can still see the paper mill in the corner right at the bottom here. The mills had to be operated outside the city walls due to the noise and the stench they emanated. What was needed next was a way to make the process of copying more efficient. And here we meet one of the most important persons in history, Johannes Gutenberg. This is actually a rubber statue, which is in the entrance bit of our museum. It's not very tall, it's about only a meter high, but I think it's very good to have it in black because he was the inventor of the black art, as printing is also called. What emerged from his invention was the Gutenberg Galaxy. The term Gutenberg Galaxy comes from the Canadian media scientist Marshall McLuhan, who said that the medium is the message, which is a very, very important observation. It is the media that forms society and not the other way around. We're going to see to that later. So the Gutenberg Galaxy expanded rapidly and had a massive effect on means of communication and society. It changed the course of history, but Gutenberg had not intended a media revolution. He tried to make his product, a book, as perfect as possible. So he intended to improve handmade books rather than replacing them. The fact that illustrations were still added by hand supports this view, and the quality is indeed very good. Try to type a page as accurate and evenly with a standard word processor. You're in for a real challenge. Nonetheless, the amount of texts that now circulated exploded in comparison to the Middle Ages. New forms of text emerged, not only books. Gutenberg himself practically only produced Bibles. Especially pamphlets started to dominate the discourse and led to the so-called public sphere, which paved the way for civil society and is the foundation of representative democracy. Here you can see a pamphlet by Martin Luther. You've probably heard of Martin Luther. It was directed against the Pope and was read millions of times. Unbelievable figures for that time. So Gutenberg's invention led to the Reformation that eventually ended the domination of the Catholic Church in Europe. And that happened although the Church tried to fight new thoughts by banning them. The famous Index Librorum Prohibitorum, which is Latin for the list of forbidden books, was implemented in the year 1559 and was officially used until 1965. But the Church had lost a lot of power until then, so the index did not affect the world as much in those days as when it came to use. Because so much more text was available, the literacy rate rose rapidly. If you wanted to be part of the world, you had to learn how to read. It's a bit like today, if you want to be part of the world, you have to have at least basic computer and online skills. I think these few examples are enough for the moment. Book printing has had far more consequences and can be considered as one of the most important inventions in history because it changed history so much. The circulation of scripture was very much increased by the emergence of a very important institution that helps to define the rise of the modern world, the post. Although this wood print here is from later, from 1648, it's a nice picture of one of these horse riders who rode around the country delivering messages and news. Franz von Taxis was his name, founded a postal service in 1490 with the aim of exchanging news and information in the whole realm. The network of post stations became denser and denser and eventually provided all regions with a connection of the postal service. At first, the service was set up by private companies. Later on, the states operated the post and in most countries had the monopoly for postal services and still have. I don't know what the situation in Pakistan is, but if I had to guess, I would say that the post in Pakistan also belongs to the government, like in practically every other country. So the amount of available information increased. Many printers, who mainly printed books, had additional capacities to also print single-leaf prints. I have three examples here. These are all predecessors of the newspapers. It's usually an event that is described in a little pamphlet like this. And here it's something military happening in the city of Nimwegen. I cannot look into the newspaper to say what exactly happened, but it's for our ears, contemporary ears, it's probably quite boring. Next thing, this is a pamphlet which we have in stock in our museum here. It's from 1577 and it shows how an army enters the city of Antwerp. There was war at that time and you can see at those times that they were quite brutal in achieving their aims. But it was enough for a printer to say, hey, this is news and I'm going to print a single leaflet and try to sell it so that people can read of this event. And this also, this is quite interesting because there was an American journalist in our museum a couple of years ago, and he asked me to translate the text here. And I said, it's the news from France from the terrible murder which took place in Blesse of the Duke so-and-so, and this journalist said, you don't have to continue reading, I read this in my newspaper today. What he wanted to say is that the contents like horrible murderers and earthquakes and whatever are still something that we are interested in today. So you can find similar subjects in our newspapers, TV news and whatever, like they were like the stuff people were interested in those days. First of all, before I now step to the newspaper, I would like to define what a newspaper is. We have 4 criteria. First of all, the periodicity. So a newspaper has to be published regularly. Secondly, the universality. The contents must not be confined to a single subject. I mean, you have magazines that concentrate on a single subject, but a newspaper has to have universal contents. Then the public accessibility. It has to be freely obtainable, and that is quite an important aspect when we talk about the public sphere. And currency. The news have to be at least fairly up to date. So the first newspaper, called Relation, was founded in 1605 in Strasbourg, a city which is now in France, right at the border, but at that time was in Germany. A city with a river. The river was needed for paper making, an expanding book printing business, and it was situated along trade routes which provided the necessary amount of news. Soon newspapers emerged in many German cities, and a bit later in the north of Italy, which had similar conditions for establishing newspapers, and then the rest of Europe, Netherlands, France, and so on. It is no surprise that the first daily newspaper, Einkommende Zeitungen, incoming news was the name, was established in 1650 in the city of Leipzig, which you can see here on a map of Europe, a city that had one of the biggest printing scenes in the country and was an important market hotspot at the crossroads of trade routes. As you can see here, that it's quite in the middle of both north and south and east-west dimensions. So it's quite in the middle of Europe, and that means a lot of news and information were passing Leipzig. And so the people who lived there and thought of publishing newspapers came up with the idea to publish it every day because they had enough news to do that. We have to keep in mind that this first newspaper business was only set up by printers. There were no editors or people with writing skills. News was a business that only the printers ventured in. The making of the early newspapers certainly did not meet modern journalistic standards. News items were printed as they were heard. There were no explanations or comments. Proper journalism did not appear before the second half of the 19th century. The contents were often bloody combats, crime, natural disasters such as earthquakes and miracles. The more spectacular, the better, for people bored what appealed to them most. So visual aspects were a key to a successful business. Of course, the makers wanted to sell many copies, so they tried to make the appearance as sensational as possible, with the addition of graphic elements that could be inserted into the printing stock of movable types. The woodcut images are a determining factor for the early newspaper business. I guess you can imagine what this newspaper is about, although you may not be able to read the German, but I think the picture tells enough. But making something visually attractive in order to make people buy it sounds quite modern, don't you think? If you take a look at modern yellow press, they operate by the same principle. Only gradually newspapers were also seen as means of transporting ideas and thoughts. The periodic press that concentrated on certain ideas led to the first magazines. Both magazines and newspapers contributed vastly to the Enlightenment movement, which is the background of the modern industrialized culture of the 19th century. Collecting newspapers is fun. To have newspapers from all over the world at hand is sometimes a bit like a holiday in space and time. Although there are large numbers of the papers in our stock that I cannot read because I lack the language skills. Maybe you saw the newspapers in the introductory video. I thought they were Urdu, but Mrs. Siddiqui told me that some of them are written in a different language. So that excels my language skills by far. But collecting newspapers is also a challenge. By the way, this is our part of our archives that you can see there. Newspapers are only made for single use. There's a German saying, nichts ist älter als die Zeitung von gestern, which means there is nothing older than yesterday's newspaper. For that purpose, you don't need the best paper quality. I mean, people read the newspapers and then they throw them away or do whatever they want with those newspapers. It would be unnecessary and would also make the paper significantly more expensive if they used better paper. So if you want to sell newspapers, you should make them as inexpensive as possible. As the newspaper became the first mass media in the course of the 19th century, a lot of technical improvements were made. Faster and more efficient printing machines, the paper machines, mechanical typecasting, and so on. And from around 1850 CE, paper was not longer made from textiles as it had been in the centuries before. It was now possible to make pulp out of wood. With this new process, it was possible to produce much larger amounts of paper in much less time with much lower costs. The path for penny newspapers was laid, but the nightmare for the collector starts. The wood contains acid, and this lets the paper decay rapidly, as you can see here. This is not too old, but I think it's enough for you to see what I mean. We have newspapers in much worse state, but I wouldn't be able to display them in order to protect them. Leave a newspaper on your window shelf for 2 weeks and you can see that it changes. It changes the color, it becomes darker, and eventually starts to crumble and fall into pieces. If you leave it long enough on your window shelf for like 50 years, you could forget about your newspaper. So for us at the museum, it is a little paradox. The older the newspaper, the worse the condition, but as soon as they are older than 1850, the condition is fine again because those newspapers were made from textile paper, which doesn't decay in the way that these do. Of course, we have means of restoration, of conservation. You can restore a newspaper, but it's very, very expensive and it's a very hard job, and we can afford only a very, very few number of newspapers to be restored every year. But our main focus lies on the digitalization. Of course, we need very large data storages because we have already digitalized about 100,000 newspapers. And if you scan them in high resolution, you can imagine that you need quite a lot of space. Today, we have more than 350,000 newspapers, and we are still collecting. When there are special events, we try to get the papers reporting about it. For instance, when Donald Trump got elected as American president, we managed to obtain some newspapers from Mexico. we thought it might be interesting to see what they wrote about a president who promised to build a wall alongside the border between those two countries. It's not always easy to get newspapers like this, but in this case, we wrote a letter to the German embassy in Mexico and asked them if they could help us, and they said just sent us a whole pile of newspapers, which was very nice. Can you still remember the caricature I showed you at the beginning of my lecture with the newspaper reader, this Daumier caricature? Here's another one. In order to get back to modern times, I want to show you this one. And doesn't this look very modern? I mean, who hasn't seen YouTube videos of people who walk into lampposts or whatever because they cannot keep their eyes from their smartphones? I think there's actually an expression calling these people smombies, which is a mixture of smartphone and zombie. And this is related by Daumier that the people in the 19th century obviously were the same with their newspapers, which I find quite funny. Well, the central element of this lecture was to show how new media, as soon as they appear, begin to change society. Welcome to the digital world we are in right at the moment. Just think about what you can do with a smartphone. And keep in mind that the first smartphone, the iPhone 1, appeared in 2007. That's just 13 years ago. And now you can use it for the communication that was unthinkable before. All the social media give you the potential chance to reach millions of people in a second. The traditional Shannon-Weaver model of communication is no longer valid. The difference between transmitter and receiver is blurred. The media system has always been a one-way street, with one transmitter and many receiver. Like at the moment, I'm transmitting and you are receiving news. News was spread by mass media via newspapers, radio, or television. With social media, everyone becomes a transmitter too, like you when you start asking your questions in a minute. That has many advantages, of course. It leads to a liberalization of the media system, but also evokes many dangers. The spread of misleading or even lying information. The rise of fake news is an alarming signal. But with fake news, one has to ask who uses this term most often. Radical elements who wish to spread their own truth discredit the media for investigating and criticizing them. It is no coincidence that the American President Donald Trump, who has just been found guilty of lying every day, is the one who shouts fake news to his critics almost as often. So for the moment, this was it with my presentation. And I'm looking forward to your questions, and let's see how we can get into an interesting talk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duspohl. That was a wonderful insight to the world of newspaper. Thank you for your time. And
Thank you.
I would like to ask you a question. So, looking
Yes.
at all the history of the newspaper, what do you think? Where does the newspaper stand in the current times?
Of course, the digitalization has led to serious problems for the newspapers because information is available online and most of it is free. So if you want to know what's happening in the world, you can just do it online. And if you do so, the newspapers who actually spend money for to pay journalists to make background stories, to do research and everything, they don't make any money if you get your information online. And so that is one of the big problems, that all the newspapers are facing economic problems, and they have less and less readers. I think that the average, our local newspaper chief editor told me, I think the average age of a newspaper reader here in this place is around 65. So the young people, they have the smartphones, and the old people still read newspapers. But we should be clear. I think I've pointed it out that it doesn't matter if you get your information online or on paper or whatever, but the information has to be accurate. So journalism and proper research is something that went with newspapers, and I'm a bit concerned that if people only communicate via WhatsApp, that the truth may be suffering. And we had some incidents in Europe and the rest of the world which can be seen as a result of this situation, like the Brexit in Great Britain. It makes no sense for Great Britain to leave the European Union, but a huge campaign made the people believe that they would be better off without Europe. And now they are facing a lot of economical and political disasters in Great Britain. That's just one example what can happen. So I'm a fan of newspapers, not because I like walking around with this paper, but because I trust this newspaper. I know that when they find something out, they've done proper research, and if not, I can prove that to them, and you cannot do that with WhatsApp. Sorry for the long answer. This is
this is perfect. This is perfect. Thank you for your comment. So if anyone has any question, they can write up in the chat box, and I can actually ask Mr. Duspohl the question they have. So, okay, so we have another question for you, Mr. Duspohl.
Yeah.
Since we see that it's about the invention of printing that has been recently discovered in South Korea. They say that the first movable printing book is not Gutenberg, it's basically the Jichki in Korea, because it is 70 years prior to Gutenberg. So what do you have to say about that?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I show you my Jikchi mug I'm drinking green tea out of. I got this in Korea. The invention of book printing with movable letters was invented in Korea about 70 years before Gutenberg. But there are two aspects about this which I think are important. The first one is that the Korean system was not so efficient from a technical point of view. The matrix disappeared because it was made of wax. So for every letter you cast, you had to produce a new wax matrix. And Gutenberg, he used reusable materials. So you could cast a large number of letters with just one matrix. That's so the main achievement of Gutenberg was not the press, the printing press. It was the how do you call it? Hand mode device, where you can actually cast the letters with. So that's much more efficient if you don't have to produce a new wax thing every time, but have one matrix, and then you can do all the letters. And the second aspect is that book printing in Korea didn't cause a media revolution. It was actually not widely used until well into the 19th century because of the Confucian legacy in Korea. People much preferred handwritten books to printed books. So they were not able to have the same impact of their metal types. But of course, from a if you talk about the history of science, you have to give Korea the credit to be first, of course.
Okay, so that's interesting. I hope the Koreans are not listening to our talk right now, so they might not like our opinion on this one. So I have another question for you. This is from Ms. Aisha Imdad. What will happen once the paper is no longer the medium of newspaper and everything is digital? How will Museum of Newspaper, your museum, will be dealing with this outcome?
Good question. We have been thinking about this. It's very difficult to store an e-paper. I mean, you can turn a newspaper into a PDF, and you can store the PDF, which is not too easy, but if you do it the right way, you can make sure that this PDF can be used in years to come. But most newspapers, they exist in a form that is called e-paper, and the e-papers, they change. So you cannot store them because they're always online and they keep adding content. So for us collecting newspapers, it will be quite a challenge when the first newspapers will go entirely online. And we have to think about that. But I'm quite confident that the newspapers will remain on paper for quite a while, because it also has quite a few advantages to read a newspaper actually from paper.
Okay. So what do you think, would you be in future recording the internet archives that are popping up right now, the newspapers archives, online digital ones?
Well, we probably have to. Yes, we haven't got a strategy yet, because so many things are just developing, and it starts with our digitalization scheme. We take a newspaper, we digitalize it, and we have to store it. But like if you store it as a JPEG, it could happen that in 10 years' time, nobody can read this JPEG anymore. So we have to be very careful on how we store the things. And we have to make sure that not an electronic problem in our archives or something would destroy everything that we have. So we have to look for safety measures and make sure that nothing gets lost.
Okay. So I hope that, yes, we have
Okay.
somebody.
Yeah, Zara here. So I was just wondering, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was wondering, you said that earlier, that newspaper earlier in the days was only about, either a crime or something that was almost like a fact. So I was
Yeah.
wondering if there's any evidence back in the days where there was false news that was printed, or something that was printed to propagate ideas that favored a particular group, considering that, it's such a trend nowadays with tabloids and all of that, ruining people's lives and celebrities. So I'm just wondering, when did it start, like, that trend?
Oh, that's very old. You can, if you read ancient Greek authors, you find the same, or like all the guys in the Roman Republic, all these intrigues and everything, a lot of rumors and fake news. I think that's quite human. And what you are referring to, the first newspapers, I pointed out the Reformation. I don't know if you are familiar with this, what the Reformation is. That in the Middle Ages in Europe was dominated by the Catholic Church, and the head of the Catholic Church was the Pope. I think he still is, but the Catholic Church hasn't got that power anymore. And the Reformation was that this monk called Martin Luther challenged the church and said the Pope is not a valid a leader for anybody. So we had a lot of wars in Europe concerning the religion. But the most important fact is that the Reformation was a media war. All these pamphlets that were written were heavy full of accusations, of false accusations, of pictures where you depict somebody as an animal and say horrible things. So all this, what we think is quite modern, is not at all modern. It's very old.
Yeah, so social media hasn't really played, well, it has played a big role into adding into that, but I guess it just started off way back.
And we are just starting to try to do something against it. I mean, take Twitter and the American president, Donald Trump, who has been, some of his postings have been, Twitter added some warnings that he's referring to fake news. I think that's quite interesting, because that's what we need.
True. So, okay, great. Thanks.
So, okay, so Andy, we have another question.
Yeah.
So how can a normal everyday person develop an understanding of filtering out the fake news from real in an environment of constant news bombardment from every social media avenue? What do you say about that?
That's the key question for our whole society, for the whole world. How can we do that? I think that it's important that especially young kids, I mean, the kids run around with smartphones as soon as they're in first grade school, that they learn that the information that comes from a smartphone does not necessarily have to be true. And so it's important that the kids learn how you can check facts, for instance. Where do you get the information from? How does the author argue? Where can he prove what he is saying? And if you do all that, you basically schooled as a journalist, and I think that's what we have to start in the education of small kids, that they learn how to separate the truth from the lies. Very much, a lot of the kids are on Instagram. My daughter is, I'm not, but Instagram is a media that has a lot of pictures in it. And it's very often used by extremists in our country, for instance, where a picture just gets a new subtitle to get the picture in a completely new context, and so have a completely different meaning. And we teach the school kids coming to our museum how you can check where a picture is from. I mean, you can just take the picture, insert it into Google, and Google tells you where the picture comes from. And in 90% of the cases, you can tell that the picture and the subtitle don't match. So that is quite a good way of finding good and bad, or separating good and bad. And on the other hand, there have been a couple of fact-checking sites in the internet. I could tell you of some in Europe. I don't know if something like that happens in Pakistan, but as soon as there are sensational news or something, there's a team of people who go and check what is right about it, what is wrong about it. And I think that's very important that all the kids especially have in mind that all the information they get can also be questionable or even false.
Interesting, very interesting. Okay, so I'm going to just ask another question. I just don't want to, I don't want people waiting. So there's another question by Mr. Mudassir Farooq. In the age of internet, do you still feel the need to collect the current newspaper, as you can still copy paste the news from all over the world?
Yes, we do. I think as we have collected newspapers for 140 years now, or even longer, it's a culture. You take paper and you print something onto these papers, and our legacy is to actually make sure or preserve these cultural values for other generations. And as long as newspapers appear on paper, we will be collecting them. By the way, what I've just said about the how can you tell if something is right or wrong, the key word is media competence. We all need media competence. Online, of course, but of course also offline. I mean, if you read books, they can also be full of false accusations or whatever. So the checking, the media competence that lies behind that is important for all means of media.
Yeah, that's true, but it depends how it works in different countries and how does that relate to the audience at the same point.
Yeah.
Okay,
I
so
mean,
yeah.
I could just pretend and say, hey, I'm calling to you from New York City. I mean, you only can see the office, and perhaps I am in New York City. But if I took my laptop and pointed it to the window, you would see that I'm not in New York, that I'm in Aachen. So I can prove that an information is right and not wrong, and that counts for every information.
Yeah, that's the call centers thing that happens all the way from India to all over the world.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have another question. So how do you think that, we can preserve or slow down the aging of publication post 1800? So when the wood pulp was introduced, how can we slow down the process of aging for the newspaper?
As I said, the newspaper contains acid, and you can bathe these newspapers in a neutral substance which takes away the acid. And then afterwards, you have to dry the newspaper. This doesn't repair the newspaper, but it stops the decay process. Until a couple of years ago, you would have just taken an old newspaper and actually put it between two sheets of Japan paper, we call it, in order to stabilize it and prevent it from falling apart. But between these two sheets, the original in the middle would still decay because the acid is still in the paper. So you have to get out the acid first. And you can imagine that that's a very time-consuming process. Bathe the newspaper, wait until the acid's out, then dry it and make sure it doesn't make any waves in the paper. And then you have to try to mend all the broken bits. So that's something we can only do very seldom because we haven't got enough money to enough budgets to do that with all your newspapers.
Okay, that's interesting. So how many newspapers have you preserved in your museum right now, and how many are you planning to have in the future?
Well, planning is, of course, depends on the budgets. We've only preserved a couple of hundred newspapers, perhaps 300 or 400, I would say. And if I had the choice, I would try to preserve them all. Although, of course, yesterday's newspaper doesn't have to be preserved right now. That's we can wait with that. But especially the papers between, say, like 1880 and 1920, they are very delicate, and that would be my top priority if I had the money to do so.
Okay. So we have another one for you right now. So what are the few environmental friendly paper making practices in newspaper industry that are practical for third world countries as well?
Well, I'm starting with a paradox. The online newspaper is less environmental friendly than the printed newspaper. Keep in mind that for printing a newspaper, you need the paper. Then you transport the paper to the printing place. There you print the paper, and then you deliver the newspapers to the stations, to the shops or whatever. And all that consumes less energy than doing the whole thing online. It's hard to believe, but the internet is something you cannot see, but it's there. It consists of huge machines which are underground and which consume a lot of energy. Greenpeace have found out that if you do a simple Google, I type something into Google and ask, and this is the equivalent of 100 meters to drive with a car. It doesn't sound much. I mean, just 100 meters with a car, that's not much energy. Yes, but how many Google searches are there every day all over the world? We're talking about billions. So every single thing that is online consumes energy. You've probably heard of the electronic currency called Bitcoin, and Bitcoin consumes just the existence of Bitcoin, just the maintenance of that currency consumes more energy than the whole country of Croatia or Greece. I mean, those countries are not as big as Pakistan, but I think you'll understand what I mean. So basically, printing a newspaper is not a really bad thing for the environment, and especially as modern paper machines operate from recycling material. Like I think in Germany, the newspapers are made of recycling paper, and I think the quote is about 98% or something. So you don't actually chop down trees and make new pulp. You just use the old newspapers and make new newspapers from them.
Okay, that's okay. So that's interesting to know. So we have another question for you. So is it safe to assume that, like any other art form, news industry is also a somewhat accurate reflection of a country's norms, cultures, morals, and religious environment? Or is it a little more complicated and layered?
Oh, well, if I understood you right, is if you're saying that if you read a newspaper, it also transports some of the thoughts, ideas, and thinking of the people who make it. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, of course. I mean, I guess that when it comes to certain subjects, very delicate political issues, things that are legal in one country and illegal in another country, or countries that are very religious and others that are not. And I think, of course, that the newspaper shows you a lot about the country. I mean, we've got newspapers from North Korea. What do you think do these newspapers contain? They are full of propaganda, and I don't understand the newspapers, but just at looking at the pictures, tell me that there is something wrong with this newspaper because there's no freedom of speech or whatever. So that is one thing you have to check when you have a newspaper from a certain country. How is the situation with the freedom of press, and how much are the media controlled by the government or the church or whatever?
Interesting to know that. I hope that answers Mizan's question right now. So when you're collecting newspapers from around the world, do you have any specific criteria in mind that
Yes. One criteria is we try to have a sample of every newspaper that exists. So if you come up with a newspaper that we don't have in stock, we're going to take it to make sure we have a copy of it. So we call that the geographical principle. If we have a newspaper from every city in the world, we are happy. And if somebody comes up with a newspaper from a city we haven't got, we are even happier. Then we try to collect newspapers from jubilees, like a newspaper that has existed for 100 years, for 50 years or so. That's a very interesting thing because there is a book published in the United States every year, and it tells you where all the newspapers in the world, when they were established. And we have somebody working here. She checks this book and sees, oh, there's a newspaper from Peru that has the 150th birthday this year. And so we write a letter to this newspaper and ask if they could send us a free copy. And that happens often. It's very interesting. Sometimes in the post, we have posts from Argentina or from Japan, just because a newspaper had its birthday. But now I think the most important part of your question was, how do I decide if a current event is worth stirring the newspaper that writes about it? And that, of course, is very difficult. Because if you take newspapers 50 years ago, you can tell, oh, I'm very surprised that they wrote about this and that, and other things perhaps that were on the headline are events which we have completely forgotten. So I sometimes cannot tell, is something important for people who go into our museum in 20 or 50 years. We just have to sort of guess a little bit. Trump's election, yes, of course. Corona, of course, we collect newspapers concerning Corona. 9/11, yes, we have about 100 newspapers about 9/11, and so on. But it could happen that something happens right at the moment and we miss it because we don't see the significance yet. So that that business is a bit subjective, but we are trying to do our best and trying to cover as much as possible.
I think everybody can hear us right now.
Yes? I can hear you right now.
Okay, so I'm just figuring there's something wrong with the screens. I think that's because of the internet.
No problem. I see your picture and I can hear you.
Okay, so we have you back.
Yeah, I wasn't away actually.
Yeah, you wasn't away. I just we wanted everybody to see you. So we have another question that you have material from all over the world, right? So
Yeah.
can you tell what has been among the most difficult material to procure and why it was difficult?
Well, it's sometimes some areas of the world are not very easily accessible, like North Korea, I just said. We got a North Korean newspaper from the German embassy. And we had, just 2 years ago, we got a newspaper from Somalia. Was it Somalia? Anyway, a country where there's war going on at the moment. And there was a journalist who went in there secretly and he got us a newspaper when he came back. So you cannot go to in Aachen to the station and buy a newspaper from Somalia. But it was interesting, this newspaper, I opened it, and what I saw was the results of the European Football Champions League. I found very interesting. People in Somalia obviously have the same interests as we have. So, but sometimes, of course, yes, it's very difficult to get newspapers.
Okay. So since you have newspapers from Pakistan and it's post-Pakistan as well, so how many newspapers were there and how long have you had them? How old are they?
Oh, I have no idea. You can check in our database and see what newspapers we have. But from newspapers that we've been having in stock for decades, I cannot tell how we got them. So I have no idea how we obtained these Pakistan newspapers. But usually it's often the same. I mean, when I went to Korea, I had half the suitcase full of newspapers which we didn't have in stock, and that's what I always do. And some people they go on holiday and they think it's a good idea to bring back a newspaper. And recently we realized that we didn't have a newspaper from Vietnam. That was like 10 years ago. I said in an interview in the local newspaper, we don't have newspapers from Vietnam. And it took only 3 days when about 20 people came around and said, well, I was in Vietnam last year and here's a copy of a newspaper, I bought that. So now we have about 20 newspapers from Vietnam, and that's how our stock gets bigger and bigger with people helping us.
That sounds wonderful. So okay, so I have another question. So that's actually a repeated question, but I just wanted to pose it again because it's from a student. So currently, yes, we can see that the newspaper, we don't use newspaper as much as we used to do before the digital age. So do you think that the digital media will ultimately replace it?
Well, I don't want that. I don't want to replace it because the printed newspapers have certain advantages. One advantage, I pointed out the environmental perspective, that it's less nature destroying than online. And plus a newspaper has 2 more advantages, which I think are something that we will be liking in the future. Take this newspaper. I don't know if you can see it. I've just got a newspaper here. I open the newspaper, and within 2 seconds, I can tell you, okay, that article is interesting for me. That's interesting for my son. This is not interesting at all, and that the whole thing takes me 2 seconds. But if you scroll down in the homepage of a news agent in the internet, a newspaper or television, you scroll down, and by the time you scroll down, the contents at the beginning have changed. So it's a linear process to obtain to get the information from the internet-based information center, but not so when I have a printed newspaper, because I can look into all the directions. You cannot do that in online. So that's a disadvantage of the online newspaper. And another one is, especially Sunday newspapers, they are a bit thicker than other newspapers. And the interesting thing about these newspapers is the things you didn't want to read. I mean, if you want to know how many people live in Tokyo, you type it into Google and within seconds you know it. But reading an article that shows you aspects of this world or different countries that you haven't thought of actually give you much more than just answering a question for you. You know what I mean? That I can read the corona figures of all the countries every day. There's this table and you see, oh, America 2 million and Brazil 1 million, terrible. And then you read a newspaper and suddenly there's a whole page written by a journalist who just came back from Argentina or wherever. And so you get an insight to something that you didn't look for yourself. With online, you have to be active to get an information. But sometimes the newspaper gives you stories how they harvest coffee in Africa or whatever, any subject, and I think that contributes to myself a lot more than just this news.
So it's a question related to when you mentioned that there were Urdu newspapers, and I told you that these are not all Urdu newspapers. So for the audience, the newspaper were in Sindhi and Pashto at the same time, and they were of pre-partition. So the question is that when you get the newspaper, do you go through the content as well? Do you try to see that if it has the quality of news in it, the fakeness of the content, the truth of the content?
Well, as I don't understand a single letter, neither of Pashto nor Sindhi nor Urdu, I have no chance of saying anything about the contents. But when we collect a newspaper, we at least want to write into our database roughly what it's about, what the newspaper is about. Sometimes we only have the information, this is a newspaper that is called so-and-so, it comes from the city of so-and-so, is in that language and from that date. And a lot of newspapers, we don't have more information about than that. But of course, if we have German newspapers or English, we have quite a variety of languages where we have voluntary workers here who are able to speak these languages, Greek, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and all that. And sometimes we have a newspaper where we think it's really interesting, we want to know what's in there, but we don't know anybody who could speak the language. So we tried Facebook once, and we got information about a Chinese newspaper because nobody can read Chinese. And that's a problem that we always have. But of course, the majority of our newspapers are German, and with the German newspapers, we see that something is obviously fake. We would write it into the information in the database so that somebody who finds that newspaper in the database knows, oh, I have to be careful, there's something wrong about the contents. I mean, check out all the newspapers we have from the Third Reich, the Nazi newspapers, which we don't display because it's against the law, but we have them here. We have some terrible newspapers, and if I start trying to comment how much is wrong in these newspapers, my text would be far longer than the whole newspaper.
Okay. So, okay, I think that's a hell as a lot of questions that we have asked you, and we just taken a lot of time of yours. I think we have one more question for you. So, do you have any recent newspaper collected from Pakistan besides the one you showed in the beginning, or?
I think the latest newspaper from Pakistan is from around 2016. I'm not exactly sure about it, but as you can take a look at our homepage, I think it's from 2016, yeah.
Okay, so I have another question that So since you collect newspaper from all around the world, so paper material wise, are they really different, or have they some printing or inks? Have they have same printing or inks, or is there a difference between in the, for instance, you know, if it's a paper from Somalia?
Not necessarily, no. Nowadays, you can have newspapers with good quality from everywhere, but you can tell that in certain situations that when, for instance, during a war, you don't have that many capacities to make good paper, so the quality is less. We have about 40,000 newspapers from the First World War, like from 1914 to 1918. We are able to tell every single day of that war with 8 different newspapers from different countries. But of course, nobody would read because it's too much. But you can see that the newspaper quality is sometimes very poor because during those war times, they just didn't have the means of making better paper. Or we have newspapers from prisoner of war camps. They are tiny, the newspapers. The paper is terrible, but the people, in order to occupy themselves in these POW camps, they wanted to publish their own newspapers, which was encouraged by the people who locked them in to keep them occupied. And there you also sometimes see very bad paper quality.
Okay, so I think that's about it. Thank you so much. There's one pressing question that everybody wants to ask you, is that since, yes, we have a global situation over here due to Corona. So what is we are in lockdown right now. So what is the situation over there in Germany?
We had quite a strict lockdown, not as bad as in France or in Italy. But we had the big advantage in Germany that the first Corona cases in Europe appeared in Italy and in Spain. So we had 1 week time to adopt to that. So the moment we had a lockdown, it prevented our health system from running into madness. So we've had around 180,000 or 190,000 cases, but very considerably few deaths when you compare that to other countries, because they had time to pump up the health system in this 1 week. And now all these lockdowns and regulations are slowed down. You can go outside, you can go into restaurants, still have to wear a mask and make sure that you stay apart at least 1.50 meters. And there's still the football matches are without audience. But some people are saying we are releasing the lockdown too early, because we now have the biggest hotspot, Corona hotspot in the whole of Europe, in a rural area. That's exactly where my parents live. There's a huge slaughterhouse meat factory where 7,000 people work, and half of them got Corona. And so the whole area is sealed off now. It's quite a problem for me. I want to go there this evening to visit my parents because they need me at the moment. And the number plate I have shows where I come from. So it could happen that you have a number plate with the GT on, and I come back to Aachen and people say, oh, no, go away, you've got Corona. So the second wave is there only in parts, and I can just tell everyone that I think that Corona is a really bad thing. It's something that we have to take extremely seriously. And you can see that in those countries where they didn't take it seriously, they're on top of the figures at the moment. United States with Trump, Brazil with Bolsonaro, Russia with Putin. All three of them are big fake news producers. They said, oh no, Corona is a hoax, Corona won't affect us. And you can see what happens if you think your own truth is better than the actual facts. And it's no coincidence that on top of the list, you have these countries. So stay alert. And when you can wear a mask and stay away from people, do it. I think we all have to do that until we all get a vaccine. Sorry for the long answer. I get carried away.
That's interesting. Actually, that's interesting to know because we had same sort of issues going over here in Pakistan. But it's interesting to know what's happening around the world and what's happening in your part of the world as well. So I think I'm going to wrap up now. Thank you, Mr. Duspohl, for coming live for us and sharing your wonderful, wonderful insight. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for the audience. Before I wrap up, I would like to mention few names, a few of my team members who had been a constant support, Ms. Zara Hafiz, Ms. Amna Hashmi, two of our students volunteer, Mr. Osama and Mr. Sheroz, who helped us in the design. And last but not the least, I would like to thank you, my dean, our dean, Dr. Samra, and our head of the department, Ms. Aisha Imdad, for making this possible for us. Thank you so much, everyone. And yes, over to you, and Andreas, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was great fun for me. And talking about these Pakistani newspapers, what we could do is we can scan them again in a high resolution, and perhaps I can send them to you, and you can, don't know, make an exhibition and tell the people what's fake and what's not. Perhaps you can have you have some use for those newspapers. I would be delighted, because for me it's just some newspapers behind me in that door where the archives are, and I cannot do anything with them. But if I can attribute, and if you can learn something about past times and something about your culture, I would be very happy. So just tell me, and I'll send them to you. And we have them rescanned and sent to you.
Yes, we have been talking about this, and I'm waiting for the lockdown to get over so that we can materialize this thing.
Very nice. Okay, and we can start scanning them.
Yes,
okay,
definitely.
Bye-bye to Pakistan, and stay safe and stay healthy, and hope to see you sometime again.
Hope to see you sometime too again. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Andreas Duspohl.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.